Welcome back, students. We're going to move forward now on some additional information out of Modular 2, Social Welfare Past and Present. So previously we talked about colonial America and really all the way up through the early 1900s. And we are now finding ourselves at a point in time in our history when we're dealing with what was known as the Great Depression. So the Great Depression occurred in 1929. It was a significant economic downturn that occurred in the United States. Businesses that had been considered stable ceased production, banks declared bankruptcy, millions of workers lost their jobs, savings were depleted, a large portion of the American population was left without any money, often homeless and without resources. As jobs became scarce, unemployment began to go up. Organized charities quickly exhausted their limited resources. At this particular time, unemployment insurance did not exist. There were no federal resources that were available to people who were experiencing the Great Depression. And since a broad swath of the country was all in the same position, it became important for the federal government to take action. So President Roosevelt instituted what was identified as emergency legislation that became known as the New Deal. It marked the first time in the history that the federal government became directly engaged in providing relief. The federal government assumed health and welfare responsibilities for its citizens. It did open the door for federal legislation to happen later on, things like civil rights and fair employment practices, and it really did establish a historical precedent for health and welfare services. It's hard to think about the fact that there was a point in time where if you did not have the money to pay to go to a doctor, you just didn't go to a doctor. We're so used now to having some form of health insurance, whether it's Covered California or health insurance through your employer. Those things are things that I think we're pretty used to. But there was a point in time not too long ago where literally most folks were paying out of pocket for things like healthcare. Great Depression and the New Deal. One of the very first programs that came out of the New Deal was what was referred to as the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was pretty much straight out public assistance. So provided food, clothing, and shelter, made monies available to states to administer relief programs. States were required to provide a matching fund. So if the states wanted to receive the FERA funding, they themselves had to come up with funding to be able to match what the federal government was providing. The other program that's highlighted here is the Work Progress Administration, provided public service jobs and hired or ultimately employed approximately about 8 million workers over the duration of the Depression. There were specific projects that both the federal and state governments had identified that they needed support with. And it's interesting because you can look at parks, streets, post office buildings, college buildings, all sorts of different kinds of public projects that were built during this particular time. And what you'll find is often they were facilitated through the Work Progress Administration. Youth programs were also established. There was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. This created work for young people between the ages of 17 and 23. They were given nominal wages. Major portion of their wages were sent back home to help support their families. And this was a program where they were often working in, public recreation areas. So a lot of our national parks benefited from the CCC program. And then finally, the National Youth Administration was established. gave work study assignments to high school and college age youth. But out of everything that came out of the New Deal, probably the most significant piece of social welfare legislation that was passed was the Social Security Act of 1935. Congress passed and President Roosevelt signed it into law. Its provisions were outlined under three major categories. There was the category of social insurance, there was the category of public assistance, and there was the category of health and welfare services. So when you talk about social insurance, think about your car insurance. You pay into your car insurance, whether you pay monthly or quarterly or annually, on the assumption that there may be a time, whether it's this year, next year, or 5 years down the road, that you're going to need to secure those funds in order to be able to cover a cost that's associated with your car. Social insurance programs pretty much work the same way. So you'll see in your payroll stubs when you're working that you're having these deductions that are being taken out. And those are all often for social insurance programs. So whether it's unemployment or whether it's Social Security, those are all things that you're kind of building a bank for because there is an assumption that there'll be a point in time somewhere down the road where you will need to secure those funds or begin to utilize those funds. So just like car insurance, that's what we're talking about here. So social insurance became the basis for financial support to the elderly, for persons who are in poor health or with serious disabilities, people who are injured on the job. So there's disability insurance, and dependents whose primary breadwinner had died. You want to recall that this was right around World War II. And so you had a lot of families who were being impacted by the fact that they had lost the primary breadwinner to the war. So a little bit more on the Social Security Act. The public assistance piece, so again, here's the second part, was based on need and was not established as a right earned through employment. So this was not one where you necessarily had been paying into it, but that there was a designated need that had been identified and that you met the qualifications. It was administered by states with money made available by states and matched by the federal government. So again, that matching funds or matching grants. It basically initially incorporated three components: old age assistance, aid to dependent children, and aid to the blind. In 1955, permanently and totally disabled component was added. Eligibility requirements were rigid and were enforced rigorously. And there was a means test, which meant that you had to fall within a certain income bracket or meet a certain qualification. So in other words, you couldn't be blind and rich. You had to be blind and poor in order to be able to receive this benefit. You couldn't be old and rich. You had to be old and poor in order to be able to receive these benefits. There was also a real concern about sort of the federal government prying into people's lives, and that was often a reason why some people declined to participate in these programs. So another piece of this was the ADC, or the Aid to Dependent Children. This was a benefit that became available to families whose primary breadwinner had passed away. There was a concern at the federal government level that people might take advantage of this as a benefit because the more children that were in the family, the higher the benefit was. So at that point in time, there was a consideration about, could there be people who are having more children simply to be able to secure more benefits? And so there was a lot of consideration for things like the worthy versus unworthy poor when you're talking about this kind of a situation, correct? The next thing I want to move into is the Great Society programs of the 1960s. So this was all under the Johnson administration. You may recall that Lyndon Johnson came into office at the time that President Kennedy was assassinated. He had been the vice president and really only served for about 5 years. He served out the balance of John Kennedy's term, and then had 4 years on his own, but then chose not to run for re-election in 1968. So this was really pushing efforts to try to lift people out of poverty. The administration based many of its social programs on the premise that the environment in which an individual lives significantly influences their personal outcome. They wanted to extend benefits to many existing programs and services designed to help the poor, the disabled, and the aged. And there's a video that is available to watch in this particular modular that gives you a great overview of the Great Society programs that were established. But here's a few. The Older Americans Act developed luncheon programs, so things like senior meals, health screening, transportation, Meals on Wheels, and recreation activities for older Americans. Civil Rights Act attempted to end discrimination in employment, discrimination in the use of business facilities, and extension of credit. And then finally, educational bills were passed that sought to rectify many of the disadvantages experienced by children of the poor. So probably the most significant as well as controversial effort in terms of social reform that came out of the Great Society programs was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which is often referred to as the War on Poverty. And this was a real flip in terms of taking a look at poverty as being something that people didn't necessarily bring upon themselves, but that may be a result of the communities or the environment in which they live. And so that was a real shift in the way that we began to think about why people were living in poverty. Poverty traditionally had been viewed as an individual matter, and its causes generally were thought to be the result of personal failure, lack of motivation, personal choices. Those that developed the War on Poverty really came to believe that poverty was the result of inadequate social institutions, schools, health facility, job training programs that failed to provide opportunities for citizens, and that traditional approaches to solving problems of poverty were unsuccessful. And so it was really an opportunity to sort of flip everything on its ear and really take a look at what we were doing and why it wasn't working and what we could do differently and how we could begin to think about poverty in a different way. This was where things like Head Start came into effect, and also community action agencies. If you live in Fresno, you may be familiar with Economic Opportunity Commission, or what's called EOC. That's a community action agency. In Madera, there's the Madera area, Madera Cat. I'm sorry, can't remember right now. Anyway, but many communities have these community action agencies that really are there to help support the community in a variety of different ways. And we are going to conclude this section here. So this is the third of 4 videos. And when you're ready, go ahead and move on through the modular, eventually getting to the final video that will take us to the current situation.